In the skies over the Kuban, the Luftwaffe's greatest aces met a Soviet Air Force they never expected, one that learned, adapted, and came back stronger every single day. How did a battered Red Air Force transform into the force that broke Germany's aerial dominance? Stay with this story, because the real turning point of the Eastern Front didn't happen on the ground. It happened in the air. The air battles over the Kuban region in 1943 were among the most decisive aerial campaigns of the Eastern Front, marking a major transition in the balance of air power between the German Luftwaffe and the Soviet Air Force. The Kuban bridgehead, located in the Taman Peninsula between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, became the center of intense combat following the German defeat at Stalingrad and the Soviet winter offensives of early 1943. The German 17th Army, commanded by General Erwin Jennecke, occupied defensive positions supported by Luftflotte 4 under General Oberst Wolfram von Richthofen. Their forces included experienced fighter units such as Jagdgeschwader 52, flying Messerschmitt Bf 109G fighters, and bomber groups operating Junkers Ju-87 Stukas and Ju-88s. The Luftwaffe still retained technical superiority, pilot experience, and coordination between air and ground forces. Opposing them, the Soviet Air Force under General Fyodor Tolbukhin's North Caucasus Front and General Konstantin Vershinin's 4th Air Army fielded a growing but uneven mix of Yakovlev Yak-1s, LeGG-3s, Lavochkin LA-5s, and Bell P-39 Airacobras supplied through Lend-Lease. The Soviet side entered the campaign with numerical advantage, approximately 2,700 aircraft to the Luftwaffe's 1,000, but faced significant challenges in training, radio communication, and tactical organization. The Kuban bridgehead's geography created ideal conditions for air combat. The flat coastal plains, proximity of airfields to the front, and relatively short flight times allowed both sides to sustain continuous sorties. The Luftwaffe constructed heavily fortified air bases at Anapa, Krimskaya, and Temryuk, while the Soviets operated from forward fields near Slavianskaya, Koronovsk, and Krasnodar. Because of the limited area of operations, roughly 150 kilometers wide, dogfights often occurred at low altitudes and within sight of both ground forces. Politically, the Kuban sector held symbolic significance for both Berlin and Moscow. Adolf Hitler regarded it as a testing ground for the restored strength of the German army after Stalingrad, while Joseph Stalin sought to demonstrate that the Red Air Force could now challenge and defeat the Luftwaffe in open combat. Both sides concentrated their best fighter aces and units in the theater. The German Jagdgeschwader 52 alone included pilots such as Günter Rall and Erich Hartmann, who would go on to become some of the highest-scoring aces of the war. On the Soviet side, notable commanders included Alexander Pokrishkin and Grigory Rechkalov of the 16th Guards Fighter Regiment, both of whom pioneered new tactical doctrines emphasizing altitude advantage, teamwork, and surprise. Intelligence assessments from both sides predicted a long and attritional air campaign. German reconnaissance over the North Caucasus reported rapidly expanding Soviet air bases and new aircraft deliveries, while Soviet intelligence identified growing Luftwaffe concentrations in the Taman Peninsula by early March. Weather conditions, strong winds from the Black Sea, and frequent low clouds would also shape the tempo of operations. As the spring of 1943 approached, both air forces finalized plans for a series of coordinated ground and air operations. The Soviet objective was to destroy the German bridgehead by isolating it from the Crimea, while the Luftwaffe aimed to protect its ground forces, maintain air superiority, and inflict disproportionate losses on Soviet aviation. This mutual dependence between ground defense and air supremacy meant that victory in the skies over Kuban would determine the outcome on land. Thus, by late March 1943, the stage was set for one of the most concentrated and prolonged aerial confrontations of the Second World War. Over the following months, more than 10,000 sorties per day would be recorded during the peak of fighting. The battles that unfolded would test not only machines and tactics, but also the strategic endurance of both nations, shaping the direction of the Eastern Front as the war moved toward its decisive summer phase. The opening phase of the air battles over the Kuban began in late March 1943, when Soviet ground operations aimed at breaking the German defensive line at the Miskako beachhead near Novorossiysk and around the village of Krimskaya intensified. These actions sought to dislodge the 17th Army from its positions and disrupt the logistical links that maintained the German foothold on the Taman Peninsula. The Luftwaffe, anticipating the Soviet push, committed a substantial portion of its available aircraft to defensive and interdiction missions, attempting to slow the advance and maintain control of the skies during the crucial early phase of operations. On 26 March 1943, the Soviet North Caucasus Front launched a coordinated offensive along a 16-kilometer sector west of Krimskaya, involving infantry, armor, and extensive aerial support. The Soviet Fourth Air Army conducted more than 1,900 sorties during the first several days of the operation, deploying fighters to clear the airspace, while Il-2 ground attack squadrons targeted German artillery in defensive positions. The Luftwaffe responded with approximately 800 to 900 daily sorties, using its Bf-109G fighters for escort missions and interception, while its Ju-87 dive bombers struck Soviet assembly areas and supply routes. The initial engagements quickly demonstrated that both sides had entered the Kuban campaign with determined strategies. German fighters attempted to draw Soviet pilots into vertical engagements, exploiting the climb rate of the Bf-109G, while Soviet units increasingly adopted coordinated group tactics, maintaining formation discipline and focusing on disrupting German bomber operations. In the first week of April, combat intensified as the Soviets pushed toward Krimskaya in an attempt to break through the German defensive line. Air battles often occurred at altitudes between 1,000 and 3,000 meters, lasting for extended periods due to the proximity of airfields that allowed both sides to return, refuel, and re-engage. One of the defining features of the opening phase was the German attempt to protect the approaches to Novorossiysk, where the 5th Luftwaffe Air Corps concentrated its efforts. The Miskako bridgehead remained a constant point of contention, with Soviet naval infantry defending their positions under continuous air attack from Ju-87s and Ju-88s. In response, Soviet fighter units flew up to 300 sorties a day over this sector, aiming to prevent German dive bombers from breaking the defenses. These operations resulted in frequent large-scale dogfights that sometimes involved 50 to 100 aircraft simultaneously. During the first half of April, the Luftwaffe maintained a relatively high operational tempo. At airfields such as Anapa and Temryuk, ground crews worked continuously to keep aircraft ready for rapid deployment. The German fighter wings, particularly JG-52 and JG-3, registered a significant number of aerial victories during this phase, reflecting their pilots' experience from earlier campaigns. However, Soviet aviation displayed growing resilience. The introduction of the La-5 and improvements in the P-39 Aerocobra's tactical employment allowed Soviet pilots to better contest low and mid-altitude engagements. On 9 April 1943, the Soviet command initiated another major offensive near Krimskaya, deploying large infantry formations supported by more than 2,300 sorties over a 3-day period. The Luftwaffe, despite its numerical inferiority, continued to launch targeted counterattacks, using concentrated fighter sweeps to disrupt Soviet bomber formations. These attempts slowed Soviet progress, but did not halt it entirely. Ground forces gained limited territory, though at considerable cost, and the air campaign escalated further as both sides recognized the strategic stakes of controlling the Kuban airspace. The intensity of the air war increased with the arrival of additional Soviet aircraft transferred from other fronts. From mid-April, the Soviets reorganized their fighter regiments into larger air groups, allowing more effective coordination in large-scale engagements. These formations often consisted of 20 to 30 aircraft operating in several layers, providing cover for the Il-2 assault aircraft attacking German defensive positions. German reports from the period indicate a notable rise in the number of Soviet attacks on supply routes and artillery positions, particularly east of Anapa. By late April, the opening phase of the Kuban air battles had established a clear pattern. The Luftwaffe's experienced and technically superior fighter units continued to inflict significant losses, while Soviet aviation steadily increased its operational strength and tactical cohesion. The daily number of sorties for both sides frequently exceeded 2,500, and cumulative aircraft losses on each side reached several hundred by the end of the month. Despite the tactical successes claimed by German pilots, the strategic situation gradually shifted as Soviet numerical superiority began to influence the tempo and scale of operations. The opening phase concluded with neither side achieving a decisive breakthrough on the ground. However, the air campaign's dynamics had changed. The Soviets began improving their command and control structure, reorganizing air units for more efficient cooperation, while the Luftwaffe faced increasing pressure to maintain its operational capabilities with declining resources. These developments set the stage for the next, more intensive phase of the Kuban air battles, during which both sides would commit even greater forces and new tactics in an effort to achieve dominance in the critical airspace over the Taman Peninsula. The strategic goals and planning for the air battles over the Kuban in 1943 reflected the broader operational objectives of both the German and Soviet commands in the southern sector of the Eastern Front. After the defeat at Stalingrad and the partial withdrawal from the North Caucasus, the German command sought to stabilize the front by securing the Taman Peninsula as a defensive bridgehead. This position allowed the 17th Army to protect access to the Crimean Peninsula and maintain a potential launching point for future operations in the Caucasus. To support this defensive posture, the Luftwaffe aimed to retain air superiority over the Kuban region, ensuring freedom of action for German ground forces and preventing Soviet breakthroughs toward Novorossiysk and the Kerch Strait. For the Soviets, the strategic intent was fundamentally different. Following the winter offensive of 1942-43, the Red Army was determined to expel German forces from the remaining footholds in the North Caucasus. Control of the air over the Kuban was essential for supporting the ground assault toward Krimskaya and Novorossiysk, destroying German supply lines and neutralizing Luftwaffe intervention. The Soviet High Command also recognized the symbolic and practical value of defeating elite German fighter wings, which had previously dominated many air battles on the Eastern Front. Achieving mastery in the Kuban was seen as a necessary step toward shifting the strategic balance before the upcoming summer operations of 1943. Planning on both sides was influenced by logistics and aircraft availability. The Luftwaffe deployed approximately 1,000 aircraft to the region at the beginning of the Kuban campaign, though the number of operational machines on any given day was often closer to 600 due to maintenance cycles and combat attrition. German aircraft were concentrated at forward airfields in Anapa, Kerch, and Temriuk, supported by an extensive network of repair workshops and fuel depots. This infrastructure allowed rapid redeployment, enabling the Luftwaffe to respond quickly to Soviet advances or regroup for counterattacks across the peninsula. The Soviet Fourth Air Army, supported by the Black Sea Fleet Air Force, entered the Kuban campaign with a larger but more varied force of roughly 1,500 aircraft, though operational readiness fluctuated due to the poor condition of many airfields damaged during previous battles. Soviet planners placed great emphasis on improving coordination between fighter, bomber, and ground attack units, forming composite air groups that could concentrate force against specific sectors. New aircraft such as the LA-5, Yak-9, and P-39 Airacobra played increasingly important roles, and Soviet engineers worked continually to expand airfields around Tuapse, Maikop, and Gelendzhik to accommodate the growing number of aircraft. An important aspect of planning on both sides involved air defense and early warning. The Germans relied on a network of radar stations positioned along the Black Sea coast. These installations provided valuable detection of Soviet bomber formations, allowing German fighters to intercept incoming raids before they reached their targets. Soviet forces lacked a comparable radar net in the region, relying instead on ground observers, radio intercepts, and patrol flights to detect German operations. Despite this disadvantage, the Soviets compensated by increasing the density of their fighter patrols during key periods of the day, particularly at dawn and dusk when German dive bombers were most active. Doctrinal differences shaped the operational approach of both sides. The Luftwaffe continued to use tightly coordinated formations, with experienced pilots leading flights that emphasized energy retention, vertical maneuvers, and disciplined attack patterns. German tactics focused on protecting bomber units while exploiting opportunities to target Soviet fighters during moments of disorganization. Soviet doctrine, by contrast, was undergoing rapid evolution. After the lessons learned from earlier defeats, the Soviet command introduced larger, more rigid formations designed to maintain aerial presence and shield ground attack aircraft during low-altitude operations. Soviet fighter units increasingly practiced layered defense, with one group engaging German fighters while another protected Il-2 assault aircraft. Propaganda also played a role in strategic planning. German reports emphasized the skill and success of their fighter aces, citing large numbers of aerial victories to maintain morale among pilots and ground crews. These figures were often highlighted in internal communications. Soviet propaganda focused on the resilience and heroism of pilots defending the Caucasus, publishing accounts of pilots who continued fighting despite equipment failures or odds against them. This messaging aimed to strengthen morale and reinforce the narrative that the Red Army was gaining momentum across the front. Both sides made significant miscalculations in their planning. German commanders underestimated the scale of Soviet reinforcements and the rate at which Soviet units could be reorganized and re-equipped. They also struggled to compensate for the growing shortage of aviation fuel and spare parts, which gradually eroded the Luftwaffe's operational capacity. Meanwhile, Soviet planners initially overestimated the effectiveness of massed ground offensives in the difficult terrain around Krimskaya and underestimated the impact of German dive bombers on their troop concentrations. These errors contributed to heavy casualties and slow progress in the early weeks of the campaign. By late April, the strategic objectives of both sides had taken clearer shape. The Germans were increasingly focused on delaying Soviet advances long enough to prepare for a potential withdrawal to the Crimean Peninsula, while maintaining enough air strength to contest Soviet dominance. The Soviets sought to break the German defensive line by integrating air power more effectively with ground operations, concentrating on weakening German supply hubs and neutralizing bombers before they could reach frontline positions. These strategic decisions set the stage for the intense clashes that followed in May and June 1943, when both sides committed their full air strength to decisive engagements across the Taman Peninsula. The planning and preparations undertaken during this period shaped the conduct of the upcoming battles and influenced the eventual outcome of the air war over the Kuban. Early engagements in the air battles over the Kuban began in mid-April 1943, as both sides intensified operations around the German defensive line near Krimskaya and the approaches to Novorossiysk. These opening clashes reflected the changing balance of air power on the Eastern Front. The Luftwaffe entered the campaign with experienced formations such as Jagdgeschwader 52 and Jagdgeschwader 3, many of whose pilots had accumulated over 50 to 100 aerial victories since 1941. The Soviet Fourth Air Army, though possessing larger numbers, included many units still recovering from earlier losses. However, the overall quality of Soviet pilots had improved markedly, with increasing numbers completing advanced training programs that emphasized formation discipline, coordinated maneuvering, and tactical flexibility. The first major engagements occurred over the German bridgehead near Miscalculations in the second half of April. Soviet bomber formations consisting of PE-2 dive bombers and Il-2 ground attack aircraft attempted to disrupt German supply routes and weaken defensive positions. On 17 April, approximately 60 Soviet aircraft conducted strikes against German positions near Krimskaya. These attacks were met by more than 40 German fighters scrambled from Anapa and Slavyansk na Kubani. In the engagements that followed, German pilots claimed around 30 Soviet aircraft shot down, while Soviet units reported the loss of 14 machines, including several Il-2s forced to make emergency landings behind Soviet lines. Despite these losses, the Soviets succeeded in delivering significant damage to German supply depots, prompting the Luftwaffe to increase the frequency of patrols over the forward edge of the battlefield. Throughout late April, The Soviets continued to probe German air defenses, testing new tactics developed during winter training. These included flying bombers at lower altitudes to avoid radar detection and forming larger escort groups of La-5 and Yak-1 fighters to counter German interceptors. One notable engagement took place on 21st April when a Soviet formation of 48 aircraft encountered approximately 30 German fighters over the foothills east of Anapa. The battle lasted nearly 25 minutes, involving multiple climbing spirals and dive and zoom maneuvers. Soviet units claimed the destruction of 9 German aircraft, though German records indicate the loss of 3 fighters, with several others damaged. The Soviets lost 7 aircraft, including 2 PE-2s that were unable to evade interception. The early clashes revealed several operational challenges. Soviet bomber groups frequently struggled with coordination during large-scale sorties, particularly when merging formations arriving from different airfields. Communication issues, limited radio reliability, and the complexity of maintaining tight formations during climbs and turns contributed to disorganization at key moments. This disarray often gave German fighters opportunities to attack isolated aircraft. At the same time, German units faced mounting pressure due to the increasing number of Soviet sorties, forcing pilots to fly longer patrols and accept higher fatigue levels. By the end of April, German reconnaissance flights reported a noticeable increase in Soviet air activity across the region. Daily sorties by the 4th Air Army often exceeded 300 compared to approximately 200 at the start of the month. German operations were similarly intense, with the Luftwaffe typically launching between 150 and 250 sorties per day. These rising numbers signaled that the Kuban region was becoming one of the most active airspaces on the Eastern Front. The first turning point in tactical development came with the introduction of Soviet aerial carousel formations during escort missions. These circular defensive patterns, tested earlier near Stalingrad, allowed fighters to protect bombers more effectively by maintaining constant coverage from multiple angles. When German fighters attempted to break through, Soviet aircraft could rotate roles, ensuring that no single group remained exposed for too long. Villages near the front experienced frequent overflights, and several bombing raids resulted in damage to agricultural infrastructure and transport routes. The Soviet command reinforced evacuation measures for communities most exposed to air activity. Meanwhile, German logistical personnel worked to disperse fuel storage sites and ammunition depots to reduce vulnerability to Soviet bombers. The opening phase of the Kuban air battles demonstrated the increasingly contested nature of the skies. The Luftwaffe maintained an advantage in pilot experience and tactical cohesion, while Soviet forces relied on growing numbers, improving technology, and evolving doctrine. These dynamics set the stage for larger, more intense confrontations in May 1943, as both sides prepared to commit additional units to gain critical control over the airspace. During May 1943, the air battles over the Kuban entered their most intense phase. To support this operation, the Soviet command organized more than 600 sorties in a single day, deploying PE-2 dive bombers, Il-2 ground attack aircraft, and mixed fighter groups consisting of La-5s, Yak-1s, and P-39 Airacobras. German forces responded with approximately 250 sorties, focusing primarily on fighter interception and targeted dive bomber strikes. Over the course of several hours, both sides engaged in repeated encounters involving groups of 30 to 60 aircraft. Soviet pilots reported shooting down 22 German aircraft, while German records confirmed the loss of 8 fighters and bombers. Soviet losses reached 17 aircraft, including 5 Il-2s that failed to return due to concentrated anti-aircraft fire near the front line. Throughout the first half of May, German commanders attempted to preserve operational flexibility by rotating fighter units between forward airfields such as Anapa and more distant ones like Kerch. At certain moments, more than 100 aircraft were involved simultaneously. German fighters attempted to break Soviet bomber formations by striking from above at steep angles, while Soviet escorts used horizontal maneuvers and coordinated turn fighting to shield the PE-2 groups. During these battles, Soviet units claimed around 30 aerial victories, while German records confirmed the loss of 11 aircraft. Soviet losses reached 19 aircraft, with several forced landings due to battle damage. May also saw the Luftwaffe deploy additional FW-190A fighter bombers from Schlachtgeschwader 1. These aircraft conducted low-level attacks against Soviet artillery and supply convoys. Their heavier armament made them effective against soft targets, but they were increasingly vulnerable to Soviet fighter patrols. On 15th of May, a group of 12 FW-190s attempted to strike Soviet positions near the Sungursky Ridge. They were intercepted by 18 LA-5s from the 152nd Fighter Regiment. Aircraft maintenance times rose, and several Luftwaffe units reported shortages of replacement engines and propellers. Fuel consumption also increased due to the high sortie rate, compelling German logistic units to prioritize fighter operations over bomber missions. Meanwhile, the Soviet side compensated for its own losses by transferring additional regiments from reserve fronts. During the final week of May, the 216th Fighter Division arrived with fresh Yak-7 and Yak-9 aircraft, raising Soviet operational strength by more than 60 serviceable fighters. Despite the Luftwaffe's continued tactical skill and efficient command structure, the balance of numbers gradually shifted in favor of the Soviets. By the end of May, the Soviets were deploying around 350 serviceable fighters and 220 bombers, while German forces operated approximately 180 fighters and 100 bombers. Both the Soviet Fourth Air Army and the Luftwaffe committed their maximum available strength, seeking to gain decisive control as ground operations continued around the Taman Peninsula. The period from 1 to 20th of June became particularly significant, as it showcased the culmination of evolving tactics, rising attrition, and the increasing asymmetry in resources that ultimately shaped the final outcome of the campaign. The month began with coordinated Soviet operations intended to support ground offensives near Krymskaya and along the approaches to Novorossiysk. On 2nd June, Soviet forces launched a new push supported by more than 550 air sorties in a single day. PE-2 dive bombers conducted repeated attacks on German defensive lines, while Il-2 units struck artillery positions and fortified strong points. The Luftwaffe responded with approximately 300 sorties, deploying Bf-109s from JG-52 and JG-3 to intercept Soviet formations. A significant engagement occurred on 10th of June, when Soviet reconnaissance detected a German buildup aimed at launching counterattacks against Soviet positions west of Krymskaya. In response, the Soviet command ordered a large coordinated strike involving more than 120 aircraft. During this operation, 3 groups of LA-5 fighters from the 9th and 229th Fighter Divisions provided high-altitude cover, while Yak-1 units engaged German interceptors attempting to disrupt PE-2 bombing runs. The Luftwaffe responded with roughly 70 fighters, including experienced aces from JG-52. The resulting battle, which unfolded between 1,500 and 3,000 meters, lasted more than 30 minutes and involved continuous maneuvering and repeated climbing engagements. Soviet formations claimed approximately 15 German aircraft shot down, while German records confirmed the loss of 6 fighters. Soviet losses included 8 aircraft, several of which sustained heavy damage but managed to return to base. The middle of June saw an increase in the deployment of Soviet P-39 Airacobra fighters, which played an increasingly important role in achieving air superiority. These American-supplied aircraft, valued for their performance at low and medium altitudes, were assigned to Soviet aces and elite regiments. Their heavy armament, particularly the 37mm cannon, proved effective in disrupting German bomber formations and damaging Bf-109s during head-on passes. Between 12 and 18 June, Airacobra-equipped regiments conducted an estimated 2,200 sorties, contributing significantly to the growing pressure on the Luftwaffe. Meanwhile, German air operations became increasingly defensive. The availability of serviceable aircraft declined due to sustained attrition and logistical strain. Several Luftwaffe units reported shortages of key spare parts, including propellers and coolant radiators for the Bf-109G. Fuel shortages further limited operational flexibility, forcing the Germans to prioritize fighter sorties while reducing bomber missions. These constraints became evident on 15th of June, when a planned Ju-88 raid on Soviet communication lines had to be canceled because several aircraft were grounded with maintenance issues. Soviet forces, in contrast, intensified their bombing campaign against German supply depots, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. On 18th of June, more than 150 Soviet aircraft participated in a major strike near Moldavansko, inflicting considerable damage on German frontline logistics. German fighter units responded with approximately 80 sorties, but were unable to prevent the majority of Soviet bombers from delivering their payloads. In the resulting engagements, Soviet aircraft claimed the destruction of 12 German fighters, while German records note the loss of 5 aircraft and significant damage to several others. Between 26 June and 3 July, Il-2 units conducted more than 400 sorties targeting German transport columns, ammunition depots, and river crossings. These attacks strained German logistics and forced supply convoys to travel at night or under heavy camouflage. On 1 July, a concentrated Il-2 strike on a German ammunition depot near Krimskaya resulted in significant secondary explosions, verified by both Soviet reports and intercepted German communications. Psychological strain became increasingly evident during this phase. Reports from German command units noted rising fatigue among pilots and ground crews due to sustained operational pressure, limited rest periods, and the constant need to prepare aircraft for rapid redeployment. The intensity of engagements required the Luftwaffe to maintain constant readiness, further burdening mechanics and support personnel. This reduction left the remaining Luftwaffe units stretched thin across a wide front, forcing them into a primarily defensive posture, focused on protecting supply routes for the German 17th Army. The Soviets quickly recognized the weakening German position. From 9 to 14th July, the 4th Air Army launched a series of intensive strikes targeting German artillery, supply hubs, and retreat routes. Daily Soviet sorties exceeded 600, compared to fewer than 200 German sorties. On 10th of July, a major engagement unfolded near the village of Moldavansko when Soviet bomber formations totaling approximately 80 PE-2 and Il-2 aircraft, escorted by more than 50 fighters, attacked German frontline positions. The Luftwaffe was able to muster only around 25 fighters for interception. The ensuing engagement lasted roughly 20 minutes and resulted in the loss of 4 German aircraft, confirmed by both sides' operational summaries. One of the most decisive moments occurred on 16th of July when the Soviet command executed a coordinated series of air operations designed to disrupt German evacuation routes. More than 150 Soviet aircraft participated in this effort. La-5 and Yak-9 fighters established air superiority along corridors west of Krimskaya, while Il-2 assault aircraft targeted German convoys moving along the Taman Road network. The Luftwaffe mounted only 80 sorties in response, primarily intercept missions. The largest engagement of the day involved around 40 Soviet fighters and 20 German Bf-109s near the village of Natukaevskaya. The battle resulted in the loss of 3 German fighters and 5 Soviet aircraft. Despite these losses, the Soviet attack severely delayed German troop movements, forcing units to seek alternate, less efficient routes. By this point, the Luftwaffe's diminishing operational capacity was evident in declining aircraft serviceability. German pilots noted the increasing frequency of tactical encounters in which P-39 formations effectively blocked their attempts to intercept Soviet bombers. This capability reduced the Luftwaffe's ability to disrupt Soviet ground support missions, which in turn increased the pressure on German defensive lines. As Soviet tactical efficiency increased, German defensive positions became increasingly vulnerable to concentrated airstrikes. On 18th July, a coordinated Soviet operation involving more than 200 aircraft targeted German strongpoints near Novorossiysk. German forces launched around 60 sorties in reply. The air battle that followed resulted in the destruction of 4 German aircraft and 7 Soviet aircraft. However, the Soviet attack succeeded in disrupting German artillery support, compelling frontline units to withdraw from several positions. The withdrawal of experienced German air units, the concentration of available aircraft for evacuation support, and the intensifying Soviet air offensive transformed the region into a theater dominated almost entirely by Soviet aviation. This phase was defined by retreat, targeted destruction of German infrastructure, and the systematic dismantling of the enemy's capacity to maintain organized resistance. At the beginning of August 1943, Soviet air superiority over the Kuban had become effectively unchallenged. Daily Soviet sorties frequently exceeded 800, while the Luftwaffe struggled to muster even 150 to 200 sorties on its most active days. German fighter groups such as JG-52 continued to operate from Anapa and Temryuk, but their strength had dwindled to fewer than 40 serviceable Bf-109s. One of the most significant air operations occurred on 18th August when more than 150 Soviet aircraft launched coordinated strikes on German defensive positions near Novorossiysk. Supported by PE-2 dive bombers and escorted by LA-5s and Airacobras, this operation aimed to weaken German strongpoints in preparation for a ground assault by the Black Sea Group of Forces. The Luftwaffe attempted to intercept the Soviet formation with approximately 25 fighters. The resulting engagement lasted less than 15 minutes, reflecting the increasingly one-sided nature of aerial combat. German pilots claimed 3 Soviet aircraft, while Soviet records report shooting down 2 German fighters. Regardless of these tactical outcomes, the airstrike achieved its operational goal. Several German positions were destroyed, enabling Soviet infantry to advance in the following days. Several Luftwaffe units reported that pilots were limited to 1 short sortie per day, primarily defensive patrols near key evacuation points. Meanwhile, Soviet forces intensified their aerial offensive. On 7th September, a major Soviet air operation involving more than 200 aircraft targeted German fortifications on the approaches to Taman. Il-2s struck German artillery and machine gun positions, while PE-2s targeted rear area storage sites. German interception attempts were minimal. Only 15 fighters took to the air, resulting in 1 German loss and 4 Soviet aircraft damaged. During the final weeks of the campaign, the air war increasingly resembled a systematic dismantling of German logistical structures. Soviet aviation focused on neutralizing the remaining German supply lines, targeting roads, ferries, rail junctions, and temporary storage sites. Between 10 and 20 September, Il-2 units conducted several concentrated strikes on the ferry terminal at Temryuk, forcing German engineers to relocate loading points and extend evacuation times. Soviet reports claim that at least 4 barges and several smaller craft were damaged during these operations. German sources confirmed significant delays, noting that evacuation efficiency dropped by nearly 30% in the campaign's final phase. Civilian populations in the Kuban also felt the consequences of the campaign. German authorities ordered evacuations in several settlements, while Soviet air operations occasionally caused damage to local infrastructure. As the front lines approached the Taman Peninsula, civilian movements increased, complicating German defensive efforts. Soviet forces attempted to minimize civilian harm by focusing airstrikes on clearly defined military targets, though the intensity of operations inevitably created disruptions. By late September, the withdrawal of German forces from the Taman Peninsula was well underway. The Luftwaffe, unable to provide consistent air cover, shifted to night operations to avoid Soviet fighter patrols. These missions, however, were limited in effectiveness due to reduced visibility, fuel constraints, and increasing Soviet night patrol activity. By 27 September, German command units reported that the majority of remaining airfields were no longer viable due to Soviet artillery pressure and constant aerial reconnaissance. On 9 October 1943, the German evacuation of the Kuban bridgehead officially ended. The Luftwaffe managed to extract several thousand personnel and some aircraft, but the withdrawal marked a strategic defeat. Soviet aviation had achieved full domination of the airspace, enabling the Red Army to reclaim the region and strengthen its foothold for subsequent operations in Crimea. The Kuban thus stands as a decisive moment, one that redefined air superiority and contributed directly to the emerging momentum of Soviet offensives across multiple fronts. From a military analysis perspective, The Kuban campaign's legacy is rooted in several key factors. First, it proved the effectiveness of Soviet aviation reforms initiated in late 1942. These reforms included reorganizing fighter regiments into larger, more coordinated divisions, improving communication and command structures, and investing in aircraft types that matched combat realities on the Eastern Front. The widespread deployment of LA-5, Yak-9, and P-39 Airacobra fighters during the campaign demonstrated the maturation of Soviet aircraft production, maintenance, and pilot training programs. By sustaining over 30,000 sorties during the course of the Kuban air battles, the Soviets showcased their ability to maintain a high operational tempo, even under demanding conditions. On the German side, the Kuban campaign exposed the limitations of the Luftwaffe's structure and strategic priorities. The Luftwaffe entered 1943 as a highly experienced force, but one facing mounting pressures across multiple theaters. The necessity of allocating aircraft to the Mediterranean, Western Europe, and the Eastern Front simultaneously stretched resources thin. The strategic decision to withdraw Luftwaffe units from the Kuban to support Operation Citadel demonstrated these conflicting priorities. The campaign revealed that the Luftwaffe could not sustain offensive and defensive operations on multiple fronts without incurring substantial losses in operational effectiveness. The attrition experienced during the Kuban air battles significantly weakened the Luftwaffe's pilot corps. Many of the German units deployed in the region included experienced aces whose skills had shaped earlier victories. These differing perspectives contribute to the ongoing historical debate about the extent to which the Kuban campaign represented a turning point on the Eastern Front. In contemporary military analysis, the Kuban air battles are recognized as a laboratory for evolving air doctrines. The campaign tested new forms of coordinated fighter operations, refined methods for integrating air and ground attacks, and demonstrated the operational value of layered air defense structures. It also underscored the importance of logistics and maintenance in sustaining high-intensity air operations. The Luftwaffe's decline in the Kuban, precipitated by shortages of spare parts, trained mechanics, and fuel, illustrated a central principle of modern warfare. Operational capability depends not only on the skill of pilots and the performance of aircraft, but on the strength of the logistical system that supports them. The legacy of the Kuban campaign extends further into post-war air doctrine. Analysts studying the conflict often highlight the importance of sustained operational pressure, which the Soviets maintained through the continuous rotation of fresh pilots and aircraft. The campaign demonstrated the effectiveness of massed air operations combined with coordinated ground actions, an approach that influenced Soviet air doctrine for decades. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's difficulties forecasted the challenges that would later be mirrored in the Western Allies' strategic bombing campaigns, where attrition and logistical strain similarly limited operational effectiveness. The campaign's significance also lies in its human dimension. The pilots and ground crews on both sides operated under extreme conditions, facing high-intensity combat, fatigue, and the constant threat of loss. The experiences of these aviators contributed to the understanding of air combat psychology, resilience, and the demands of sustained aerial warfare. They highlight the interplay of strategy, logistics, technology, and human endurance. They mark the moment when the Soviet Air Force emerged as a force capable of shaping the front's operational reality. And they underscore the broader shifts in the war, shifts that would eventually contribute to the defeat of Nazi Germany and the redrawing of the geopolitical landscape of Europe. The legacy of the Kuban, therefore, is not limited to the battles themselves, but extends to the profound and lasting impact they had on the course of the war and the evolution of modern air power.